Welcome to the Training Innovation Project, or TIP Learn at Lunch, where our goal is to build the capacity of vocational rehabilitation professionals to serve people with disabilities and engage with employers through innovative training and technical assistance. Today's topic is strengthening the workforce, the business case for hiring and retaining qualified people with disabilities, presented by Lori Mays, Senior Program Manager, Kentucky Chamber Foundation, and Johnny Collette, Deputy Executive Director for External Affairs at the University of Kentucky Human Development Institute. Lori serves as Senior Program Manager at the Kentucky Chamber Foundation, where she leads statewide workforce initiatives that connect employers, educators, and community partners to strengthen Kentucky's talent pipeline and expand economic opportunity. A recognized leader in job quality and workforce innovation, she is a U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation Fellow, Aspen Institute Job Quality Fellow, and member of Kentucky's Employment First Council. Johnny Collette's distinguished career includes serving as the U.S. Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, along with leadership positions at the Council of Chief State School Officers and the Kentucky Department of Education. Johnny has dedicated his work to improving education, employment, and community outcomes for people with disabilities through collaborative systems change and cross-sector partnerships. We plan to leave time for questions today, but you may also enter them in the chat throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to respond. A recording of today's presentation, along with a calendar of future events, is available at tiptrain.com. And for now, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Beth. And I'm so excited to be here with Johnny Collette today. I appreciate you all having me on and being able to share this topic with you guys. So just kind of some housekeeping, looking at our objectives for today's work. We're going to look at workforce participation, kind of setting that stage of why a lot of industries and other employers are looking for what they would consider alternate or new workforce development strategies and what that gap looks like for individuals with disabilities. We're also going to look at summarizing the evidence that looks at supporting that business case. So how do we educate employers about hiring, retaining, and then supporting this population, as well as identifying employer practices and workforce strategies, as well as local, regional, statewide, and national partnerships that can be utilized, as well as resources. So we want you to walk away with all of that information, as well as this is really a starting point for understanding this work more deeply and having a better connection with networks and resources across your work. Next slide, please. So when we are looking at the workforce crisis, and the next couple of slides are going to be numbers and data specific to Kentucky, but these are numbers and probably stories that are very familiar to your local state, your state and your local areas and regions as well. But this will help kind of set the stage for why Kentucky looked at engaging individuals with disabilities specifically as a workforce strategy. And so if you go on to the next slide, we talk about workforce participation in several different ways. And what workforce participation by definition is looking at the population that is 16 or older, who is either employed currently or is unemployed but actively looking for work. So this excludes individuals that are institutionalized in any capacity, that are on disability, etc. But these are individuals who are actually working or currently looking for work but are unemployed. So that is that participation, workforce participation kind of definition. And so if you look at kind of this over time, we say oftentimes in Kentucky and nationwide that this is not an issue that has come about quickly, and that way we're not going to find solutions quickly, right? So this has been an ever-growing issue. Here in Kentucky, which is the blue line on your screen, is compared to the U.S. workforce participation. So it mirrors the national kind of data, but it is consistently lower. So here in our state particularly, we have a workforce participation rate that mirrors that national average, but is also significantly below it and is consistently below it. And so we use that metric and that data with our employers to really help them to understand that if you're looking back 26 years now for this data, that is what it looks like a long term. And so when we particularly look at participation rates in bordering states. Kentucky has a lot of bordering states. We are consistently towards the bottom, not only nationally, but also for our border states. West Virginia and Kentucky often compete for that low spot, which is not somewhere we want to be. So these are all metrics that we utilize with our employers for them to understand kind of the landscape of the overall workforce participation and what it looks like in our state and those competing states next to us. So if you go to the next slide, we're going to kind of zero in a little bit farther when we talk about prime working age. So prime working age for workforce participation, as it's kind of defined nationally, is 25 to 54. So if you remember that workforce participation age, it's anyone over 16. And so that there's no like upper cap on that. Whereas the prime age is defined as 25 to 54. So kind of after that post-secondary education time and then before the retirement time. Again, Kentucky is shown that we consistently are below the national average. We do have more ups and downs than the national average does. We do mirror it similarly. But this is probably going to be similar to other states as well, that states, not only politically and others, have different things that are going to have that average fluctuate probably more than when you look at the national average. But again, this doesn't change from what we see from the workforce participation as a whole. That prime age working also is below the national average for here in Kentucky. So if you go to the next slide, again, this looks at our bordering states. Again, we are towards the bottom with West Virginia. So this is not only with our border states, but Kentucky is consistently towards the bottom as a national average. So this is just another way for our employers to understand what the landscape looks like in their state and where they're operating and how that is a contributing factor when they're trying to build workforce strategies. So if you go to the next slide, these are some root causes for Kentucky, but also can be seen to some degree nationally as well, of why we see workforce participation issues in Kentucky. So in our state in particular, 48% of Kentuckians have skills training beyond high school, so about half, whereas 58% of our jobs require training post high school. Now, whether that is a four-year university, community college, certificates, somehow credentialing in any way. So that is anything post high school, any type of skills training or education training post high school. So there is a mismatch in skills and education between what Kentuckians are receiving and what there is shown to be needed for the jobs that are available within our state. As the entire country saw, there was a huge retirement of kind of the baby boomer generation during the 2020 pandemic. We have not seen that recover by any means after the pandemic. Our workforce participation rate, partially because of retirements, excessive retirements, but also because of people leaving the workforce for various reasons during the pandemic, has not come back to pre-pandemic levels. And so not only are you losing individuals within employers' spaces, but you're also losing that institutional knowledge. And that has been a huge deficit for a lot of our industries they're not only losing those skills and those people, but they're losing that knowledge within their industries and their businesses. One of the things that the Kentucky Chamber Foundation is really centering on right now is kind of wraparound services that prevent people from being in the workforce. And one of those is childcare. So as somebody who has middle school and high school age kids now, we're a little bit past the childcare, but it is a huge issue for a lot of Americans, especially Kentuckians that reside in what we consider childcare deserts. So there's not just a lack of good childcare, but there's a lack of childcare in general. So people are not able to come into the workforce and fully participate because they are caring for young children. We are also seeing an increase in elder care needs. So if they are not having to be home and out of the workforce because of children, they are now coming out of the workforce to care for relatives or elders in their family or in their circles that are also needing full-time care. So that is another cause that we're seeing for our workforce participation from being lower. Kentucky is somewhat unique, but also shares a lot of similarities with some other states, especially in our surrounding area, with the opioid crisis. So there's been a lot of work done in our state in the last 10 years, around 10 to 15 years around the opioid crisis. But in Kentucky in particular, we had in 2020 a 49% increase in overdose deaths in Kentucky. So that is seeing people permanently, obviously, leaving the workforce because of those overdose, but also we're seeing people that are out of the workforce temporarily because of substance use related strategies. So these are not the only things that we are seeing in terms of being causes for low workforce participation in our state and in our region, but these are pretty high contributing factors in Kentucky. Every state is a little bit different, but there is oftentimes those underlying causes that is not strictly related to education, et cetera. Transportation is another big one that we see here as well, with those kind of wraparound services needed for people to be fully engaged in the workforce. And so I say all of this to kind of set this stage. When we're working as at a programmatic lens from the Chamber Foundation, oftentimes our employers really need to understand where they're starting from, right? They may not have strategically looked at the disability community as employees. They may not have been able to fully educate themselves as a business on how to interact with this population, how to hire and support them, et cetera. And this is kind of our business case. And what does that look like in our state? So these are all metrics that we utilize so that they understand the larger scope outside of their particular industry or out kind of their particular business of what the landscape looks like in terms of workforce participation and workforce development. And then we are able to then really pinpoint and dive deeper into particular populations like the disability population. So I'm going to turn it over to Johnny now to specifically talk about that population and how that kind of relates into our larger story of workforce participation.
Thank you, Lori. And as we think about workforce participation and addressing workforce shortages and meeting labor needs across the country, one of the things that we often say here in Kentucky, and I think I first heard our partners at the Kentucky Chamber Foundation say it this way, we can't afford to leave anyone behind. So one of the things that in our objectives you saw is we want to talk about the gap in employment as it relates to people with disabilities. And that's what we're going to focus on today. One of the largest demographic groups in our country and an often overlooked source of untapped talent that really should be at the forefront of our workforce planning. So next slide, please. So as we think about disability prevalence, people with disabilities represent one of the, as we mentioned, one of the largest demographic groups in the United States. So we're talking about 1 in 4 Americans. In fact, most recently I saw it's probably more like 1 in 3.6. So we're probably up to about 26% of Americans adults identify as having a disability. So just think about your day. 1 out of every 4 people you pass on the way to work, at church, in the grocery store, or even perhaps on this webinar may have a disability. Next slide. So while people with disabilities present one of the largest, one of the nation's largest demographic groups, they're also significantly less likely to be employed than people without disabilities. And you see that if you're able to engage with the slide, you see that statistic there. 43% of people with disabilities are employed compared to 78% of people without disabilities. Next slide. So again, we're thinking about these shortages, these labor needs across our country. You heard Lori talk a bit about that. We're specifically highlighting some of those gaps for this large demographic group, people with disabilities. So the previous slide referenced the employment gap. Well, this slide focuses on people who are not employed, but who are actively looking for work. So they're unemployed. So even among those seeking employment, people with disabilities experience unemployment, as you can see on the slide, at about twice the rate of people without disabilities. So 11% compared to about 5%. Next slide. This may be, to me, I think it is the most significant statistic of all. So think back where we just were, 11% of people with disabilities are unemployed, but 52% of people with disabilities are not in the labor force. So that means they're not currently working and they're not currently not actively looking for work. So 52% not in the labor force. As we think about our workforce shortages, as we think about, as business thinks about its labor needs and employers think about recruitment and hiring of a workforce to meet those labor needs, we've got, again, a large demographic group and a large portion of that demographic group who are not engaged in the labor force at all. So a potential real pool of talent here. So that 52%, that's not what we want for people with disabilities. More importantly, it's not what many people with disabilities want, and it's certainly not what employers need in today's workforce. So that's why what we're going to mention next, competitive integrated employment, is so important because competitive integrated employment helps us support people with disabilities in finding meaningful jobs in the community. And it helps us help employers to connect with an often overlooked talent pool. Next slide. So now this slide on competitive integrated employment, as you can tell, it's very dense with words, okay? And I'm sharing that because I do think it's important that we see the statutory language, the language of the law with respect to the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. But as we look across all of those words, very simply put, when we're talking about competitive integrated employment, we're talking about jobs where people are paid at or above the minimum wage and who are paid even more than that, who are paid comparable in a comparable rate when compared to their non-disabled peers who are doing similar work for that employer, right? So at least at or above minimum wage, and then also that comparable rate, if whatever that is for those who are doing similar work. Competitive integrated employment also means working in jobs where people with disabilities interact with others without disabilities. It means that these are jobs where people with disabilities receive the same benefits and opportunities for advancement as employees without disabilities, again, who are in similar positions and who are doing similar work. So think of competitive integrated employment then as the goal. And competitive integrated employment certainly is the goal for many people with disabilities. And then the policy framework that establishes that as the expectation, not the exception, is something we refer to as employment first. So let's look at that on the next slide. Employment first, and we are grateful for our partners at the Association of Persons Supporting Employment First and state chapters and other people doing great work in this employment first space who say it like this: real job, real wages, real opportunities. That's what we're talking about here. Exactly what you want, I want, every citizen wants, right? Whether people have a disability or not, we want real jobs, real wages, real opportunities. And employment first is built on that belief that people with disabilities are part of that workforce, that people with disabilities can work, and that competitive integrated employment should be that first and preferred outcome. So again, competitive integrated employment is the outcome that we're thinking about and talking about for many people with disabilities. Employment first is that policy framework, those things we put in place in our states and localities and municipalities that create or establish that expectation that our citizens with disabilities are going to be in the workforce, they're going to be in our communities, they're going to be doing everything everybody's doing, right? In most states, that's been growing over the years, sometimes at higher rates than others, and in some places in the country more than other places. But overall, this belief and this sort of approach and focus has been growing across our country. And most states have adopted something in that space of employment first. Some states may have an executive order. That's what Kentucky had for several years, two executive orders. And then ultimately, those executive orders and employment first was codified in law in 2022 in Kentucky. That's a similar journey with other states. So most states in our country have something, an executive order, a legislative action or some administrative policy. So, to the extent that in the work that you lead and do, to the extent that you've not had opportunity yet to leverage that in your state, there's likely something there in your state that you can leverage. Again, thinking about this outcome, thinking about the policy framework that animates it, the policy framework that can enable it, and how do we leverage that in our states. Next slide, please. Oh, by the way, on that last slide, the last slide had a link on it to an Employment First map. That's from APSE, or the Association of Persons Supporting Employment First. I'd encourage you to look at that map. That's where you can go and see what's going on in your state with respect to Employment First. Now, some common myths, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, and in a moment I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to say more about some of these in the following slides, but a few of the common myths that I'm sure we've all heard are on the slide there. Again, if you're able to engage with it. If not, I'm going to share. I'm actually going to say these. People with disabilities prefer not to work. That's one of the myths, right? We know it's just the opposite of that. We know it's exactly not true that people with disabilities do want to work, like we all want to work. Most employees with disabilities require accommodations is another myth. I'm going to talk about why that's not true in a moment and show you that. Workplace accommodations are expensive. You already know what the answer is going to be. It's not true, and we're going to show you that in just a moment. Employees with disabilities are less productive than other employees. Also not true. So I'm going to talk about just a few of those in just a moment, very briefly, so you can have those numbers and that evidence for your own benefit and the work that you lead. But before I do that, I do want to point you to something for if you're interested in an in-depth conversation around this notion of myths that are common for people with disabilities and employment and how we debunk those. The Training Innovation Project recently held a master class. In fact, it was last month in June. Dr. Phil Rumrell from Michigan State University, and it was, and you the link is there, and you'll be able to interact with this link when you can get these slides. Setting the record straight about hiring and retaining workers with disabilities, debunking myths. So I encourage you to spend some time there if you're interested in learning more. It is a deeper dive. It's about an hour. And if you're interested in this, I'm going to suggest it's worth your time. So next slide. Accommodations. Let's talk a little bit about that. How, as low cost, high impact is what we want to be able to show. And I think you'll see that in the following slides. Next slide. Remember, one of the common myths is that people with disabilities require a lot of accommodations. Well, in fact, what we know is only about 1/3 of workers with disabilities use any accommodation. Next slide. One of the common myths we cited just a few moments ago is that accommodations are costly, that they're really expensive. Just the opposite, right? The majority of workplace accommodations we know cost nothing to provide. And when there is a cost, it's often a one-time cost, and it's probably around $500 or less typically. Next slide. Productivity and safety. That was one of the other myths that you saw, that people with disabilities are less productive. Maybe there's an increased risk of things happening that aren't good. Well, in fact, again, we know that's not true. We just talked about accommodations, and what we find is that accommodations and these workforce supports that we have been talking about actually enhance productivity. And in fact, workers with disabilities have nearly identical productivity and safety records. Now, wanted you to have this information as evidence, but again, I'm going to point you back to that master class if you want to dig a little deeper on those. But for now, in the interest of time, let's move forward. So we've been talking about people with disabilities as this large and often overlooked talent pool that can help meet employers' workforce needs. We've talked about the outcome that many people with disabilities want, competitive integrated employment. And we've addressed very briefly at a high level a few common concerns. But the question many employers still ask is, okay, what does this mean for my business? What's the return on investment for me? And folks, that's a fair question to be asked, right? So what we want this to be a win-win, and it is a win-win, and we know that, and we want to share that. Look at what the evidence tells us. on this slide that is before you. 97% of human resource professionals tell us that people with disabilities are performing as well or better than their peers without disabilities. Now, that runs contrary to a lot of, again, the common myths that we hear, a lot of the things that get repeated. I heard someone say a long time ago, it doesn't have to be true. It just has to be repeated over and over again, right? Well, that's what happens. Things get repeated over and over again. But then when you look at the evidence, you find out, well, here's the truth. The evidence is just the opposite, that people with disabilities are performing as well or better. And we hear that from almost every HR professional that is asked this question. Secondly, you've got evidence is suggesting that people with disabilities remain in their jobs longer. Employers know better than anybody the costs associated with turnover when people leave jobs, and you're investing more and more money in recruiting new talent and hiring new talent and then developing new talent. And so people with disabilities remaining in their jobs longer, it can be a real plus for those businesses, those employers to help reduce costs associated with that turnover. Companies who are leaders, companies that and businesses that do a fantastic job supporting people with disabilities in the workforce, as you can see here, also demonstrate a stronger financial performance. So 1.6 times more revenue, 2.6 times more net income, 2 times the economic profit of their counterparts. So they're outperforming their peers. So again, you think about these risks. Well, if we do this, if we're very intentional about really tapping this untapped talent pool, this pool we may not know a lot about yet, what's the risk for us? Are we going to suffer some loss for this? What we actually find is over time that these companies, these businesses, these employers are outperforming their peers. And there also may be other benefits to engaging this population of job seekers. Could be federal and tax incentives related to hiring and supporting people with disabilities. So the bottom line, really, that I'm trying to convey through my portion of this, and hopefully we'll see this that you'll see this come together in both portions of our time together today, is that expanding employment opportunities for people with disabilities is essential to strengthening and growing America's workforce. One of the things that I get to do is also be a member of our state workforce board. And let me encourage you, again, from where you lead and from your perspective in this work, if you're engaging your state workforce board intentionally around this population of job seekers, I encourage you to keep doing that, redouble your efforts. If you're not, hey, don't leave that on the table, because state workforce boards, and then if your state is a state that has local workforce boards like we do here in Kentucky and many other states, that's a great infrastructure, a great group of professionals, a diverse group of thinkers to engage in these conversations about how we more intentionally recruit this population of talent, and how we make sure in times of significant workforce shortage and crisis, as Lori mentioned, that we don't leave anyone behind. So recruiting and hiring and retaining and advancing workers with disabilities, we believe, is good for business, and it's good for our country. So next slide, I did want to just make sure you know this slide is here. There were a lot of statistics that were on this slide. I've got links to the source documents or source pages for a lot of that on this slide. When you're able to interact with the PowerPoint, you can go there and get all of that information. And certainly we remain available to you if there are additional questions that we can help with. But Lori, let me turn it back to you to kind of wind us down in our presentation time today.
Thanks, Donnie. So on the next slide, I'm going to stay here for just a minute because I want to introduce an opportunity that we have presented to our employers here in Kentucky, but that can be replicated across the nation, and it can also be brought down to the regional and local level as well. So at the Chamber Foundation, we have what we call employer academies. We hold several of them, and one of the ones that we're going to obviously speak on the most today is our Disability Hiring Academy. Our academy kind of framework came about because our staff here at the Chamber Foundation continually had questions about what we consider opportunity populations, whether that's those in long-term recovery, have a justice-involved background, military, et cetera. And how do employers engage those populations? How do they support them once they're employed, et cetera? And one that we continually had come to us is employers that were interested in more strategically engaging the disability community. And so we put that into our academy framework and created the Disability Hiring Academy, which was presented by the Human Development Institute. We're fantastic partners in that. And what that looks like is the one that we have held so far, it was a 3-day program, and we'll show you the agenda here in a moment. But really the goal of our academy was to not only educate our employers on the particular population, but also what do those best practices look like in hiring? How do you contact that population? What are the resources available? How do you have best practices within HR and upper management as well as frontline supervisors? What does that look like on a practical matter? The great thing about our academy model is it not only brings that information to our employers, but it also sets them up as kind of a starting point. So it connects them with a greater network of resources, resource providers and organizations, as well as, kind of handheld resources, but it also connects them to other employers who are doing this work. So whether they have been in it for a while and want to get better at it, whether they are just kind of dipping their toe into this population, it really brings together employers from all business sizes as well as all industries to kind of come together around that collective desire to engage and do well with this population. And so that is kind of an added benefit for attending employers. And so at our inaugural Disability Hiring Academy, and we'll get into some of the statistics in a minute, but if you will go to the next slide, and these are probably a little small, you guys will be able to see these better when we share them with you. But this was a 3-day, so 3 full days, which is a big ask of employers. And so we'll talk about how we're shifting the Disability Hiring Academy a little bit towards the end. But you can see some of our agenda items that we kind of broke it into those 3 days. Day one was literally understanding and recruiting disabled talent. So what does that look like? What does demographics of the disability community look like in Kentucky or in your particular region of Kentucky or local area? And then how do you tap into that talent? How do you reach them? How do you communicate with them, et cetera? Day two looks specifically at hiring and onboarding them. So once you have recruited them, you've gone through the hiring process, what does that look like in terms of onboarding them? How do you need to make adjustments where necessary? What does that look like from an HR standpoint for your particular business, et cetera? So you can kind of see these agenda items specifically. And I will say that this particular agenda was helped put together through an advisory council. So the Chamber Foundation's kind of bread and butter is facilitating and bringing stakeholders together, right? We are by no means the subject matter experts on any of these populations that we center around with our academies. And so we bring together an advisory council that is consumer of individuals and organizations that work with this population on a daily basis. So we will bring to the table as the Chamber Foundation the questions and the topics that we often get asked from our employers. We bring that to the advisory council and say, this is what our employers are wanting to understand, wanting to get better at, wanting to create. Then the advisory council will come in and also say, this is what we wish they knew, that they don't know what they don't know. And we will kind of marry those two things and create an agenda. So this is what both of our employers are asking for and what our kind of population specialists are wanting to kind of push out education wise to our employers, which is how this agenda came to be. So then if you'll go to the next slide as well. So this was our 3rd day. This is looking specifically at once they're hired, once they're onboarded, once they're part of your population within your business, how do you support and retain them, right? And so we kind of did some different things with the Disability Hiring Academy, which I think were super successful that we haven't done with previous academies, is we really engaged the population itself. So we were able to have individuals that kind of represented different areas of the disability community come in and speak with our attending employers. We were able to showcase hands-on accommodations. We were able to have different individuals and different organizations that support the disability community to be front and center. And so that was really helpful for our employers to be able to engage not only with support organizations, but also with the population itself. So we did a lot of kind of get up, move around, go to different kind of tabletop discussions, et cetera. And then kind of the culmination you can see there at the bottom of our agenda was we had disabled talent employer testimonials. So we had individuals come in that were hired on by particular organizations or particular employers, as well as the employers themselves, speak to that process. They spoke to what would be beneficial to improve on from both the individual disability individual's perspective as well as the employer perspective. They talked about where they had done things well, where they had kind of skinned their knees. They had, really come forward to the attending employers to say, we're here to be mentors, we're here to answer questions. And that was another really great thing that came out of our academy, is that employers that were doing really good things in this space already were very willing to be that specific individual businesses mentor. So, they were able to call them and say, we're thinking about doing this. Have you done it? What works? What doesn't work? And so this was, in terms of the Disability Hiring Academy, really a jumping off point for employers to learn about the population and then move forward in their workforce strategies. So if you go to the next slide, we had some fantastic kind of outcomes from this. One of the things we do is we do surveys of our attending employers before the academy. So we want to understand where they're coming into the academy, what is their familiarity with the population, how comfortable do they feel in employing and retaining these individuals, et cetera. And then we ask them what is their initial kind of work with any resources that we're going to present to them. And then we do a follow-up survey directly after the academy, as well as 90 days after. So we want to understand what they learned, how, do they feel more comfortable around this population in terms of hiring them? Have they utilized resources more willingly after being presented with them? What does their hiring look like of individuals from this population post-academy, et cetera? So this particular academy, we had 24 attendees, and really our goal was to keep it at 25 or under, because we want it to be a small group that can engage. They represented 18 businesses. So we had 6 industries represented. This is specifically, we wanted manufacturers to be beside healthcare professionals. We wanted them to be beside agriculture, et cetera. So that kind of brings a great mix to the attendees. One of the fantastic things, and this is actually the highest kind of numbers we've seen of any of our academy populations, is that within 90 days of the academy, so at that 90-day kind of survey mark, there were 22 individuals with disabilities who had been hired by employers that had attended academy that they attribute specifically to learning about this population through the academy and contributing to the resources that they were connected with. That's huge, and that's significantly higher than our other populations. And these are just, and there'll be some testimonials on the next slide too, but really the knowledge that employers gain from not only the academy itself, but also being connected to other organizations that work with this population, debunks a lot of those myths that Joni spoke about, but also gives them practical next steps of how to implement this within their businesses. So these are testimonials. They're a little bit long, so I'm not going to read them word for word, but really it looks at these 3 specifically talked on being more educated on the population itself, understanding better how they can support this population as employers, how it relates to what they feel like is their corporate responsibility to their communities and the populations that their communities represent, really understanding inclusive hiring practices, how to go about identifying accommodations for individual people, and really kind of having a broader understanding of the population and how they can better integrate those individuals into their businesses. So this has been a really fantastic thing that we have expanded to in terms of this population. I will say that we do have another Disability Hiring Academy in the works. It is going to be a 1-day program that is going to be more centrally rooted in a community in kind of the western part of our state. That is an area that is seeing huge growth within the disability hiring kind of space. and they are putting together a fantastic one-day agenda for local employers to be able to not only be connected to what we presented at the statewide academy, but also have more specific regional and local resources and connections to employers in that area that are hiring this population. And so this is a model that we've taken from a statewide lens that we're going to compress down into regional and local focuses, but they can also, we are seeing replicated across the nation as well, and can be utilized for different populations and different topics. And then we've also had different industries be interested in different things, et cetera. So this is a way that we are taking all this information that Johnny and I have spoken about with this population and how to integrate them more readily into the workforce, and how do we get that information to employers and then support them in being able to hire this particular population. So happy to take any questions on that. I know that we are moving into kind of the question portion of that, and I'm happy to answer any of that, but I think that Johnny and I specifically are working kind of on two different sides of this, but see it integrated and married very seamlessly in the workforce, and helping to be able to support not only the population, but the employers that hire them.